Hello, it's Andrew here yet again, and this is episode 88. And today's really a kind of continuation of the last episode, 87, which starts with the issue of a man looking lustfully at a woman and committing adultery with her in his heart. And so we pick it up at Matthew chapter 5 verse 31. And here's Jesus again saying, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say unto you, that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, as I said, this is a continuation of the previous reflection, where Jesus is basically warning his hearers about what they entertain in their minds and in their hearts. It may appear to start off small and be relatively harmless, yet, if fostered, will ultimately take over one's life. The issue of divorce is something that in my years of parish ministry I have rarely talked about. And part of the reason is that when I look at the words of Jesus, they seem so uncompromising. He's so clear about it. There's no wriggle room, none at all. And when you know that you have got a number of people in your congregation that are married for the second and some for the third and maybe even more times, you're on a hiding to nothing to actually start talking about it, certainly in the way that it appears. And the coward in me has consistently avoided it, because there are questions that I've had and harboured in my heart and mind that don't seem to fit with what Jesus is saying. And so rather than come out with a hard and fast thing, well, this is the word of God, this is what Jesus says, this is how things are, it has seemed to me less than useful and less than helpful. So, here we are. Jesus moving on to the possible consequences of adultery, which is divorce. And I want us to notice that he's talking to men. I think that's really, really important, that he is focusing his attention on men. And what he's saying basically is that the grass is always greener in the neighbouring paddock. Well, we know that. And one tends to idealise what one doesn't have, imagining it to be better than what one does. Jesus shows the danger here of feeding this fantasy. It can lead to divorce. But this needs to be understood, and here's the thing that has really turned me around on this over the last few years, is to understood in its time and place. This is where context isn't everything, but it's pretty well close to everything. This is why we need to really understand the times in which Jesus is talking into, because I'm not sure that he would say the same thing to us in 2020. Certainly not in Western Aotearoa, New Zealand, here in our day, in our age. But in his day and his age, we need to understand what he's actually doing here and why he's saying what he doesn't, what he's saying. Women in first century culture where he was, first century Judaism, were very much dependent upon the men in their lives for their material well-being, be it a father or a husband. She was like a piece of property passed from one male to another. And they were dependent on the new man in their lives. The father would hand them over to the husband, and he was responsible for looking after them, for meeting their most basic material needs. It would appear that divorce in Jewish society was both relatively common and easy to arrange. Whoops, I've just lost my screen here. And it would seem that it was mostly initiated by men. Now, the words of Jesus abhorring divorce came as a shock to his disciples. And we see it further on in Matthew 19. And their response is, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Clearly, they saw Jesus' version of marriage as a potentially unwelcome restriction on their freedoms. They wanted to be able to let go of their wife if the wife wasn't up to the mark, if the wife wasn't satisfying them, if the wife wasn't pleasing them, if she was losing her looks, whatever the reason. They wanted to be able to release her. And to know that they could do that actually allowed them, I suspect, to be able to maybe hang in there. I don't know. But it gave them a sense of they were in control of this. And I don't know about you, but I think that's quite shocking. It's absolutely appalling. But this is how they were, even the followers of Jesus. You know, it's better not to marry if we're going to be tied like that forever. We can't just get rid of her and get a new one. Oh boy. So Jesus' intent, I want to suggest today, is to protect the woman. Because once discarded by their husband, they had very few options. They were unlikely to secure a new husband, as they were regarded as used goods. We see the case, for example, of Ruth and Boaz being an exception to that. Any arrangement that they could organise was likely to put them well down any household pecking order. Their father was unlikely to want them back, as they now had few prospects for the future and were regarded simply as a liability. Clearly, the fact that their husband needed to divorce them indicated that they were found to be inadequate in some way, and this brought shame upon the wider family. So what option was left? Well, for many there was only one, and that's prostitution. For many, this became the only realistic way of putting a roof over their heads and food on the table, and particularly if they had children that would depend on them to be looked after. One can see why Jesus was so opposed to divorce. It put women in a very vulnerable position. The NRSV, here quoted, puts this clearly as causing her to commit adultery. That the man is forcing her into this position, because she's not going to make it on her own. Jesus is also clear that anyone who marries a divorced woman also is committing adultery, presumably a warning not to go lusting after your neighbour's wife. And the whole point here, I suspect, is more than anything is to protect the social order. And as we read it, as I said at the beginning, Jesus is clearly addressing men. It is predominantly a male problem. Now, the New International NIV Reader's Version puts an interesting spin on this. It says, divorcing your wife makes her a victim of adultery. Well, this is two-edged. It can be read to assume that she's being divorced because the man has found a new, more preferred model and is therefore committing adultery, of which his now former wife is the victim. Or she is being forced as a victim into adulterous relationships. But what we see is that Jesus puts no blame on the scorned woman. In the end, we see Jesus' intent is to protect the vulnerable. It may be that in today's context in New Zealand, he would not take the same line, as the circumstances are very different. Women today have resources. Women today have independence, and they have a freedom that they never had. They're more than able of making it on their own. As we see, there's been a shift in society. Women are increasingly the ones who are commanding the high-paying jobs, and right across the professions. We see that they're the ones who are succeeding, and the men are actually being left behind. And while Jesus may still not be happy about divorce, I suspect it will be for quite different reasons. The reality is that divorce always, pretty well always, does some damage. And yet, and this is the question for me that is always, as for years has bugged me, are we going to suggest that a failed marriage is the only sin that can't be forgiven? Seriously? That doesn't make sense. That there are times when, for whatever the reason, it's better to draw a line under a relationship than that has become toxic and is destroying the people involved. It's a question, isn't it? Now, I was going to talk about what I talk about at weddings. I think I won't do that today. Maybe another day. Maybe when we get up to chapter 19, we'll talk about it then. But I think that's enough to get a real sense of what Jesus is saying here. And I just want to say that Jesus is concerned with fullness of life. He's concerned with people being able to make new beginnings, to start each day with a sense of knowing that they're loved and that his commitment to them is the fullness of their life. Now, this is not to suggest you should just be rushing out and getting divorced. I don't believe that at all. There are many things that, many factors involved here that may mean that it's actually not necessary, and that a relationship can be restored, and that a couple can move on with a richer and fuller and more beautiful life together if there's some key decisions that they can make. But I'm not going to talk about that today. God bless you.